Welcome back to the channel, guys. This is Scott K. Recently, we have been seeing a huge insurgence of new switches coming in from all over the place, and one of the newest brands that we're starting to see is Tecsee. They initially started to become known for their entry with the PME Kingfisher series linears, then more recently their Mint linears that I have reviewed on this channel. Today we'll be looking at two of their tactile switches with a ice cream theme, the Neopolitan ice cream and the coffee chip ice cream. Let's get started. The Neopolitan is a very tactile switch with a pink, white, tan color scheme mimicking the Neopolitan ice cream. The upper housing is pink and the lower housing is translucent white, and they're both made of polycarbonate. The stem is a tan and it's made of palm. What is interesting about the Neopolitan is its spring. It's an extra long 63.5 gram two-stage spring, which actually helps to create a very snappy tactile feel in this switch, especially at key press. What's more interesting about the Neopolitan is that these are supposed to mimic the feel of a very expensive Franken switch, the Zykos switch. The Zykos switch is actually made with Zelio's V2 lower housing, Panda upper housing, and a halo stem, so I wonder how they fare against it. The coffee chip is similar to the Neopolitan that it's a very tactile switch as well. It has a very coffee-like colorway with a tan and dark brown combination. The upper and lower housing is both made of a tan PME material, and the stem is made of palm similar to the Neopolitan. Another notable difference is that the spring in the coffee chip at a heavier 68 grams, but actually features a standard shorter spring design. Both the Neopolitan and the coffee chip is considered a long stem switch. So let's do a quick comparison against the quintessential long stem tactile, the Holy Panda. Compared to the Holy Panda, both the Neopolitan and the coffee chip is both longer, with a tactile bump that seems to go on a bit longer as well. However, upon closer inspection, I feel that the stem for both the Neopolitan and the coffee chip are actually identical, with the exception of the color. With that said, I gathered up a handful of popular tactile switches on the market so we can do a sound test comparison and pit them against each other for tactility, smoothness, wobble, and the like. Let's get started with the sound test. Let's do a direct comparison between the Zykos and the Neopolitan now. Pretty interesting, right? Sound-wise, the new Neopolitan and the coffee chips are pretty deep and thocky switches. I'll provide a chart in the end to show you how they all fare against each other. Now let's move on to the next test, full typing sounds. First up is the Neopolitan switch. For the sound test, I'll be using my modified Tokyo 60 switches. Now, let's swap out the Neopolitans and give it a go with the coffee chips. As evident in the individual switch sound testing, the Neopolitan and the coffee chip is a very Thoccy switch. Between the two, the coffee chip is actually the Thockier one and the Neopolitan is the more tactile one. From the sound test, you might have noticed a new keycap set. The set is called PBT Lord by Milkyway Caps. These are from the first group buy that ran some time ago, featuring a thick PBT mold with extremely crisp die sub legends. I'll be doing a full review on PBT caps in the near future, but I can say that these are definitely on the higher end as PBT caps are concerned. Now we're going to try out my non-scientific stem wobble test again. This is very subjective and it's mostly my opinion, so please take it with a grain of salt. So first we'll be testing the east and west direction, and then after that north and south. So first up is the coffee chip, and overall it's pretty tight, not bad. The Neopolitan is not bad either. I feel like it's a little bit looser than the coffee chip, but not bad. Next is the Boba U4T. It's pretty similar so far. It's pretty good. And next is the Thocc sunflower. The sunflower has almost no play. I think the sunflower is probably one of the tightest housings you can get in a tactile switch so far. Then it's the Azure Dragons. Azure Dragons definitely have a little bit more play than the others so far. Not too bad. Now the Holy Pandas. The pandas do have a little bit of play. It's similar on the level of Azure Dragons. The Glorious Pandas, very similar to the Holy Pandas. So the two pandas are pretty similar to each other in terms of east and west. Gatoran Cap Browns definitely has a good amount of play east and west. Akko CS Ocean Blues, it's about middle of the road. And finally the Zykos, probably similar to the Holy Pandas. Yeah, it's similar to the Holy Pandas this way. Now the north and south. First up, as similar to the first test, is going to be the coffee chip. Wow, the coffee chip definitely has a little bit more play north and south. And same thing with Neopolitans as well. More play north and south than it was east and west. Boba U4T is actually much tighter north and south versus east and west. And unsurprisingly, the Thocc sunflower is pretty tight up and down as it was left and right. Azure Dragons has a good amount of play, definitely pretty loose north and south. Holy Pandas as well, definitely not as good north and south. Glorious Panda pretty similar. I think the two pandas are once again pretty similar to each other. Gatoran Cap Browns, it's actually much better north and south than it was east and west. Akko CS Blues, actually pretty good north and south for the Akko CS Blues. And the Zykos I'm sure is similar to the Holy Pandas, and it is. All the switches were optimized with film as necessary. I want to show how these switches compare in terms of tactility against each other. In stock form, remember that the Neopolitan spring is actually 63.5 grams and the coffee chip is 68 gram bottom out. However, the length of the spring matters in this demo. The Neopolitans, even with the lighter spring bottom out, has greater potential energy at top and hence feels more tactile as well. So what happens when I swap all these switches with the same 62 gram long spring? Remember what I said about the stems on the Neopolitan and the coffee chip about them being probably the same? Let's see what happens. Now you can see that the two are equal in terms of being able to press the other one down. I am now fairly certain that the stems and the leaves are the same for these switches, and probably the housing mold also, with the exclusion of the material and ultimately the spring. So what does that mean? If you want best of both worlds, you can put a long spring in the coffee chip and get a super tactile and super Thoccy switch. In my previous sunflower review, with the same spring swap, none of the other tactiles I had was able to beat the snappy tactility of the sunflowers. The same is true here with the Neopolitan as well. Both are fitted with the same 62 gram spring. So what happens when you compare it to the benchmark Holy Panda? With the same 62 gram spring, you can see that the Neopolitan has a bit more tactility. So I conclude that the Neopolitan is somewhere in between the sunflower and the Holy Panda switch. Now the moment you've been waiting for. I created my standard switch performance chart to pit all these switches against each other. So let's take a look. Remember, this is based on my opinion and opinion only, so it's very subjective. So please remember to take this with a grain of salt, and the results also may vary depending on the tolerance of the switch and the lube application and etc. So we'll be looking at a total of 8 different criteria today. On the first page, we're looking at stem wobble, smoothness, sound, and pitch. First up is the stem wobble, which goes from loose to tight, obviously tight being the better of the two. With that said, out of all the switches, the Duroc Sunflower is dominant in this area. After that, the new Tecsee Ice Cream Twins follow suit, and then the Aqua CS Blue, then the Boba U4T. Honestly, these 4 switches are so close to each other that they might as well just be stacked on top of each other. Then comes the Panda switches. They're very similar overall in terms of wobble, and finally the Azure Dragons and Gateron Cap Browns last. Next up is the smoothness of the switch, from buttery smooth to scratchy not smooth. So first up again is the Duroc Sunflower. With its special blend UHM-WPE stem, it's very smooth. The Azure Dragons are also right up there, very smooth switches. Here's a surprise, Gateron Cap Browns rank 3 here. Most cap switches are actually very smooth. This is followed by the Holy Panda, then the Glorious Panda, the Aqua CS, and finally, I feel that the Boba, the Neopolitans, and the Coffee Chips are a bit on the scratchier side. Moving on to sound, this is not the pitch, but rather how loud the switches are during typing. Overall, the Aqua CS Blues lead the pack here with a very clacky sound. It is followed by the Azure Dragons, which are also fairly clacky, then the Panda switches, with the Holy Panda being more clacky than the Glorious Panda, then the Duroc Sunflower, the Neopolitan switch. Finally, the Boba U4T, the Coffee Chips, and the Gateron Cap Browns are more on the subdued sound, perhaps feeling that way because of the deeper sound profile they actually have. Speaking of deeper sound profile, this is an area that many of you are very interested in, the pitch. So similar to the clacky sound, the Aqua CS switches lead the pack with a very high-pitched sound. Azure Dragons follow suit again, then the overall ranking becomes very random. The Holy Panda, the Duroc Sunflower, the Glorious Panda are somewhat in the middle of the pack with a very medium depth sound. Then you have the Neopolitans, the U4Ts, and the Coffee Chips being deeper. Out of all these, the Coffee Chip actually bests the U4T as the deepest Thocc here. Okay, now the next page, we are going to be focusing on the tactile characteristics of the switches, then the cost. First up is the overall tactility, rather the amount of tactility. This goes from high to low. From the top, you have the Duroc Sunflowers being the most tactile, similar to what we have found before as well. Actually, this cluster of switches up here, the Sunflowers, the U4T, the Neopolitans, the Azure Dragons, are very much all hyper tactile switches. Then comes the next batch of Panda switches and the Coffee Chip being super tactile. After that, you get a small fall off with the Aqua CS and then a huge fall off with the Gateron Cap Brown, and that it was to be expected. Moving on to the next criteria, the type of tactility. The scale goes from sharp to rounded. Many of these newer hyper tactile switches feature a very sharp type of tactility. Once again, the cluster of switches including the Sunflowers, the U4T, the Neopolitan, the Azure Dragons, Coffee Chip, and even the Aqua CS is all very sharp. They are so close to each other in many cases that they might as well be stacked. Then you move down to the rounded, and for those that have tried out the Panda switches, you know that the tactility is strong, but it's rounded, so it travels from the top to bottom in a more consistent fashion. Browns are brown, so they're somewhat round, but they also have a very small bump, so it's very hard to notice. Now the bump location. This is where you actually feel the tactile bump as you actuate the switch. With the exclusion of the Gateron Cap Browns, they're all located towards the top. Done. And finally, the only objective portion of this comparison, the cost. At the time of this review, the Holy Pandas were the absolute most expensive at a whopping $1.16 a switch, even besting the switches from Zeo. Then you get a fairly heavy drop-off. You get a cluster of 60 to 70 cent switches from the Sunflowers and the Neopolitans to the Azure Dragons tying up the bunch. Then you get to the Coffee Chips at around 47 cents, and finally the more budget options with the Aqua and the Gateron Cap Browns around 30 cents. For 30 cents, the Gateron Cap Brown Thoccs. I hope this chart was helpful. I know that there's a lot of switches this time, so it was a bit harder to organize, but I hope that the visual representation is helpful in helping you find the right switch you're looking for. So, what are my final thoughts? I feel that the overall switch market is becoming very saturated with a crazy amount of options. However, this is not necessarily a bad thing because it offers the consumers like us choices. With that said, I feel that the Neopolitan and the Coffee Chip switches are actually a welcome addition to the foray since they do offer some unique characteristics. For example, the Neopolitans are very tactile with a unique spring design that offers a snappy typing experience. It's also a cheaper alternative to the crazy expensive Zykos you can make for about $2.16 each. On the other hand, the Coffee Chips are an amazing bargain considering that they offer a very satisfying tactile experience with a deep Thocc that even bests the Thock King, the Boba U4Ts. So at the end of the day, it's a preference thing. If you want more tactility, you go with the Neopolitans. You want the deepest Thocks, then you go with the coffee chips. For me, I would take the coffee chips and add in a longer spring to get best of both. As usual, if you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and I will have more content for you in the future. Thanks.